Oh, you guys can see my screen. Awesome. Keyboard can be on the other side. Let me see if I can share, and I will. Sorry, I'm just gonna stop hearing. Yeah. I don't think I need that. Cool. Oh, well, we want the opposite. Sorry, give me 1 second. Just got to switch the displays real quick. Wow, that did not work. Is there like a switch to the right of it? Okay, let's try. Oops. Here? Amazing, thank you. What's your name? Greg. Shout out to Greg. What's going on, everybody? My name is Hassan. Very happy to be here, and I work over at Vercel. Quick show of hands, who here has used Next.js before? Wow, amazing. Most of you. You're welcome, by the way. No, a shout out to the Next.js team. They've been doing an incredible job. I think JJ from the Next.js team is here today. I can't see him in the crowd, but shout out JJ. So we at Vercel are the creators of Next.js, and our platform supports deploying over 35 different frameworks like Remix and Nuxt and SvelteKit and Next.js. But what I'm here to talk about today is actually the Next.js app router, starting with the motivation of why we built it and talking about some of the main features in it and how to actually use it. And then I'm going to end the talk by talking about Next.js Commerce and this little rewrite that we've been doing. So as you may know, we introduced Next.js 13 last October with the new app directory, or app router, as we call it now, in beta. And this is really our take on aligning with the future of React and all of the incredible primitives that were released in React 18, like React Server Components and Suspense. And this really represents a shift in how we're going to be building Next.js applications moving forward. And I want to talk to you about this shift today. By the way, shout out Roselle for that great demo. In case you were wondering, yes, I did bribe her to include Next.js in her Copilot demo. But yeah, she did great. But yeah, in my talk, we're gonna be talking about routing specifically and how it affects data fetching and rendering here, or as I like to call them, the 3 pillars of front-end applications. But to give everybody some context, let's take a step back and briefly go over how routing works in front-end applications. And we're specifically going to be covering how routing works from the lens of the type of applications you can build. So multi-page applications versus single-page applications, and more recently, hybrid applications. So in the early web, the way routing worked was honestly pretty simple. You just had a specific file on a server, and you had a route that pointed to it, right? So think languages like PHP. And then later on, we use these dynamic server-side languages to kind of generate a response for a specific route. And so this is what's called a multi-page application, or an MPA, where routing is done entirely on the server. And the big disadvantage here is on navigation. So when you try to navigate to different routes, you get that full page refresh that is just not very optimal for users. So then came single page applications, which are web apps that can dynamically rewrite what's on the current page without causing that full page reload that multi-page applications cause. And so this is really inspired by native applications, specifically native mobile applications, because they had all of these really cool UI patterns and really cool transitions that honestly the web had never seen before. So the way single page applications work is that routing is done entirely on the client. You start off with a blank white screen, and then the client determines, kind of what resources to render. And then on navigation, the client will just rewrite the data that's on the page. So the pros of single page applications is that you get these really nice and smooth transitions, but they also have a lot of disadvantages, like a slow initial page load and using a lot of JavaScript. So 2 years ago, Rich Harris had this incredible talk that went more in depth into these single page applications versus multi-page applications and kind of discussing the pros and cons of each. It's an amazing talk. I highly recommend you check it out. But if you haven't, the main takeaway that I want to focus on for today is that he recognized this emerging trend in our industry that he describes as transitional apps. So apps that can actually transition between the client and the server depending on which one is most appropriate. So transitional apps essentially try to combine the benefits of both single-page applications and multi-page applications, and they're kind of what we're doing and what we're trying to do with Next.js. So now that we talked about routing with in front-end applications in general, let's kind of view it in the sense of React specifically. So while React didn't really invent single-page applications, I think it's definitely fair to say that it contributed heavily to its popularity. The fact is, React was, and still is, very much focused on rendering and UI, which kind of led the community to come up with different routing solutions. And so one of these routing solutions that quickly rose to popularity is React Router. So React Router's approach is essentially component-based routing, where every component maps to a specific URL. And when you combine it with a tool chain like Create React App, you kind of get a really nice stack to build these single-page applications. Who here has used React Router and Create React App? Yeah, the majority of the room, right? I think we've all used the stack at one point. It's great for building these single-page applications, and it's really what contributed to making React so popular. So then in 2016, Vercel introduced Next.js, which is a framework to help build to help essentially build server-side applications easier. And so Next.js took a slightly different approach when it comes to routing. It does what's called file system-based routing, where every single page, and I don't, okay, my slides are back, where every single page maps to a specific route. And although Next.js apps felt very similar to multi-page applications, especially on initial page load, it used techniques like prefetching and client-side routing to give applications that SPA-like feel. And so in that sense, it resembles hybrid apps more. Another incremental step towards hybrid applications in general was data fetching techniques in Next.js, like get server-side props and get static props, which are data fetching techniques that essentially encourage developers to move data fetching outside of rendering code so that you can fetch data both on the client and the server. So in early 2020, when honestly everybody was freaking out about COVID and rethinking their life decisions, the React team was thinking about the future of React. And more specifically, they were kind of thinking about if we can move more rendering to the server. And the idea here is that if we have to go to the server anyway for data fetching, can we do some of that rendering work on the server as well? Can we take advantage of that same request so that we can send less code back to the client? And so you can imagine some of the responses to that tweet or that sentiment in general, which is like, are we just pivoting back to MPAs? Because remember, we started in MPA land and with PHP, and then we kind of transitioned to single page applications with React Router. And then now people are like, wait, are we just going back to MPAs? Like what's going on? But to quote one of my favorite people on Twitter, Swix, who's sitting right there, he had this great tweet that's basically cynics. That's basically cynics see a pendulum. So all cynics see is this like switch from SPAs to MPAs, when in reality, what's happening is a series of switchbacks of incremental improvement, right? We're not purely SPA and not purely MPA, but something that combines the benefit of both. And each time this conversation was brought up, the React team was also very careful to emphasize that what they were looking for is a hybrid approach. And again, an important takeaway here is that this would take advantage of that, of requests that already need to exist, and it wouldn't create additional requests. And then in December of 2020, the React team came out with something that would enable frameworks to move more towards this hybrid approach, which is React Server Components. When you combine React Server Components with features like suspense and streaming, we have the primitives or the building blocks to essentially address a lot of the disadvantages of MPAs while maintaining the user experience that single-page applications give us. But there's one last piece to the puzzle, and that is the Next.js app router. It's almost stable, has a lot of cool things and a lot of cool features that I'm going to share with you in a second. But I also want to mention that the app router is just one implementation of this React architecture, right? Technically, any framework can build on top of these React primitives and take advantage of them. And we've done that very intentionally with the Next.js app router built on top of React server components. So with the React server components specifically, we can actually have client components and server components in the same page. So instead of React rendering your entire application on the client side, React now gives you the flexibility to choose where to render your application based on what's most appropriate, right? So on this slide, we have a page, and we split this page into a bunch of different components. And you can see a lot of these components are non-interactive. Like we have the nav bar and the sidebar there. So those can be rendered as like on the server. This can be rendered as server components. And the clients that do need interactivity, like the search bar or the button, we can render these as client components. And this really falls in line with Next.js's server-first approach in the app router, where everything is a React component by default, and then you can opt into client components specifically. So we'll touch on this later as well, but React server components also drastically simplifies data fetching to the point where Dan from the React team kind of made this tweet that says, you never have to write another API again, right? Which is a little bit of an exaggeration, which he did mention in the next tweet. But I think it really represents this mindset shift in the app router, where because most things are server components, you can co-locate your data fetching from inside of your components as well. But of course, we have, we also have route handlers in the app router, which is our version of API routes, where you can still create your APIs, and you still might want to do that for things like authentication, for things like mutations, because the team is still working on a native way to handle mutations. But it's really, really cool that you can co-locate essentially your API calls within your components. And so let's take a quick look at how you can do that. So this is a React server component, and you can see that we've defined this function called getData at the top. You can call it whatever you want, but it's just an async function. We're fetching data here, and we're returning JSON. And then inside of our React server component, all we have to do is await that component. And then we have the data, and we can use it inside of our JSX. And it's just a really, really nice model with everything co-located in one place. And so if you think about it with this new model, it becomes very important to kind of split up our URLs into these smaller fragments, or what we like to call route segments. And so these route segments essentially map components to different URL segments. And although we're breaking up routes, we're still maintaining file system-based architecture. And so, for example, if we want to create a dashboard page in the pages folder, all you have to do is go and create dashboard.js, or I'm sorry, dashboard.tsx. I mean, who uses JavaScript anymore, right? No, JavaScript is great, but TypeScript is better. So dashboard, so in the pages folder, you create your dashboard.tsx file. In the new app router, you create a dashboard folder and then a page.tsx file inside of it. So we're still maintaining that file system-based architecture, but splitting up routes. And this really has three main benefits, splitting up these routes into smaller segments. The first one is that we're able to create layouts. Layouts are a highly requested feature from our community. And in this situation, I'm defining layouts as UI that's shared across sibling routes. And very importantly, these layouts actually don't re-render or lose state on navigation. The second advantage to breaking up our routes is that on navigation, the server actually only has to fetch and re-render the segment that has changed. So we're not re-rendering the whole subtree. We're not re-rendering the whole page. We're only re-rendering the parts that have changed, which is pretty cool. And then third, you can have more granular control over data fetching by allowing each of these route segments or each of these components to fetch their own data. So you no longer have to do data fetching at the per page level. You know, if you know with get static props or get server side props in pages land, you kind of have to wait for these data fetching methods to fully run before any components on your page render. But now you can actually fetch in every single component, which is cool. This minimizes waterfalls and also reduces the amount of time it takes to fetch and render the content of a specific route, especially because you can do these in parallel. So overall, by building our router on top of React server components, we're able to reduce the amount of work that the server has to do. And yeah, we're able to reduce the amount of work that the server has to do, especially on navigation, where we're only re-rendering the parts of the page that have changed. And overall, we're able to reduce the amount of code that's also sent back to the client. So we talked a little bit about the history of routing. We talked about the history of routing in React. And we also talked about React server components and why we're investing so heavily in it with the app router. Now I just want to talk a little bit about the app router in general and some of its cool features and kind of how to get started. So to get started with the app router, all you need is to create a folder called app and to drop 2 files in there. We have a layout.tsx and a page.tsx. So for our layout.tsx, and we talked about this is basically just shared UI between different routes. And for our root layout, what's cool about this is that it also replaces the _app.tsx and _document.tsx in pages land. And then we have a page.tsx file, which is the equivalent of any file in the pages directory. It's just the React component. So this is what the 2 files will really look like. That's our root layout. And as you can see, we have an HTML tag and a body tag. And these tags are required in Next.js because it doesn't provide it by default. And you can see this is traditionally what would have been in _document.tsx. And then we have our page.tsx, which is just a React component with a very important distinction. It's a React server component. Because remember, all components are React server components by default. If you want to opt into client components, you can do that by just adding use client to the top of the page. And you are going to want to do this when you have pages that handle interactivity, right? If you want to use any React hook, like a use state hook or a use effect hook, or if you want to do an on-click, you're going to want to do use client on the top of the page. Then comes nested routing, which is the idea that you can nest layouts within each other throughout the app. And this is really enabled by the React architecture because everything is suspense aware, like our CSS, our data fetching, our routing, like literally every part of the framework is ready for parts of the UI to kind of come in and be streamed in independently. And so nested routing is kind of the ergonomic way to do that. It's the way with good DX. And the UX benefits to it, obviously, is that parts of your application won't re-render on page transitions. And you can also retain state, which is nice. One of my favorite features actually is co-location. We have some special files in the Next.js app router, like page.tsx and layout.tsx, like we talked about. We have a few others, like loading.tsx and error.tsx, which do exactly what you think they do. And we have a notfound.tsx as well, which is the page or the component that will render if the user tries to navigate to a route that doesn't exist. So outside of some of these special file names, you can actually drop anything else that you want inside of these route folders, and our Next.js app router will just ignore it. And so what's cool is you can co-locate components. So in this situation, we have a dashboard route, and we have a navbar component that's being used in that dashboard route. And what's cool is we can just drop it right there. And we can drop its CSS, and we can drop its tests. We can drop whatever files we want and co-locate stuff here. If you hate this approach, it's completely fine. You can still use your component folders and do things the old way. But the cool thing is you have the option to kind of structure or do your file structure however you want. So next up is our metadata API, and really it's just a simplified way to set link and meta tags in this cool declarative way, and also supports static and dynamic metadata. And another cool piece about our metadata is you can actually just drop certain file names in there. So in this situation, we have our favicon.ico that we dropped at the top. And the app router will just recognize this and will just use that as the default favicon for your app. And the same goes for OG images, which is my favorite type. Let's say you have a careers page, and when you link your careers page on Twitter, you wanted a fancy OG image that says "Join the company now" instead of just the default company logo. All you have to do is drop an open graph-image inside of your career route, and that will be the OG image. So it's pretty cool that you can define things like that. And then data fetching, which we talked about, that's been drastically simplified. The big difference in the app router is that everything is cached by default. So everything is very similar to get static props. And you no longer need to use get static props or get server side props or any of that. You can just fetch with async await like we saw. And then even if you want to do dynamic data fetching, you just set a cache of no store. And you can obviously still use all the advanced data fetching techniques in Next.js, like incremental static regeneration, by just specifying a revalidate period. Cool. And then we have route handlers, which is our version of API routes in the app directory. All you have to do is create a route.ts file, and you create these functions for depending on the HTTP method that you want. So in this case, we have a GET request. You can create another POST request, and you can kind of drop these wherever in your application, and they just allow you to create these custom request handlers using these standard web request and response APIs. These are mostly inspired by SvelteKit. Yeah, I saw one. We have one SvelteKit user here. And then we have loading UI, which is, you can drop a loading.tsx file, and it uses suspense to do loading, and so it helps consolidate spinners and indicate that work is being done on the server. So that's what it is. And very importantly, I want to mention that the app router is extremely incrementally adoptable. You don't need to move over everything at once. Even if you do want to migrate, you can have both the app directory and the pages directory inside of your application. And also, pages isn't going anywhere. That's going to continue to be supported as well if you want to stay there. So if routing, data fetching, and rendering are the three pillars of front-end applications, I'd like to argue that URLs are the foundation. Right? I think the web has something truly special in the sense that we can link any piece of content on the web through any device through URLs. So it's very, very important for us to provide, with the app router, to provide these simple conventions that don't just make it easier for developers to implement these great UI patterns, but also embrace the web platform by not breaking URLs. So this is the last thing I want to talk about, which is Next.js Commerce. So back in 2020, we released Next.js Commerce, which is an all-in-one e-commerce starter kit that was platform agnostic. So it supported a bunch of e-commerce providers like Shopify and BigCommerce and Swell and stuff like that. But recently, though, we decided to do a refresh and rewrite it to use the latest Next.js features. Being platform agnostic is theoretically pretty good, but it comes with a much more complex architecture to allow that flexibility. And you can kind of see that in the PR that was actually just merged 2 days ago. But we removed like 150,000 lines of code and added 6,000 lines of code because with this new version, it just focuses on a single provider, which is Shopify. So it's built with Next.js 13 with the new app router, Shopify, and Tailwind CSS. And really, the three goals of us doing this refresh is to provide a singularly focused template that's focused on one e-commerce providers and kind of shows the best practices for building e-commerce apps with the app router, and also demonstrates a lot of Next.js's latest features like the app router and React server components and suspense and edge functions and route handlers and a lot more other things. And the last thing is it includes a lot of missing real e-commerce features that are honestly missing from a lot of other templates, things like handling out of stock, handling variants, and actually fetching everything from the provider. So we're actually fetching everything in our menus and sidebar and stuff directly from Shopify. So it's fully dynamic. So two important things that we learned from this rewrite that I kind of mentioned in this presentation is that it's important to remember that everything is cached by default. And that's kind of the new standard in the app router. And the other thing is it's great to think about, you kind of have to think about this React server components versus React client components now, because everything is a React server component by default. And so you have to think, okay, like if I have a button here, if I have interactivity, I have to define something as a client component. So those are the two takeaways that we took away from that. And it's going to take time for people to adjust, but I think I think these are really, really excellent patterns. But yeah, you can check it out today. The PR is fully merged at github.com/vercel/commerce if you want to look at an e-commerce app with the app router. And so overall, that's kind of how we're thinking about the app router. Those are some of my favorite features. There's a lot more. You can check out our docs if you want to. But essentially, it allows you to create these performant experiences by reduces the amount of work on the client by moving that work to the server, and also reduces the amount of work on the server because on navigation, only the specific segments that have changed are actually re-rendered, right? So there's less work on the server through that. And then ultimately, there's less code sent to the client, which is great. It allows smoother experiences because you can use shared layouts and loading UI and suspense and instant transitions. And it allows us to create shareable experiences through some more advanced routing techniques that I actually did not cover today, like parallel routes and intercepted routes. So last but not least, I'd like to give a few shout outs before I end. Shout out to my colleague Delba for doing an incredible job with the new Next.js docs and for a lot of the design and slides from this presentation. Shout out to the React team for just building great primitives like React Server components that have allowed us to build on top of it. And shout out to the Next.js team for actually building all of this cool stuff that I get to come here and talk to you about today. And thank you all so much for listening. Appreciate it.